Okay, we are
Are you live? Okay.
We are live.
Okay.
Hello, everyone who's joining us. We're just getting settled in.
I don't see you yet. Hold on, give me. Is it us, or for some reason it's showing up the old one? Moises, are you live yet?
We are live, and Inclusive Collective has also shared the live stream from where I can tell.
Yes.
Okay. It is 12:30.
Should we start?
Let's start.
Let's do it.
All right. So, gosh, one-on-one with Ken and GSC, we survived. There's so much work behind the scene, and there's a lot of issues to take care of. But so Moises and I, we're so happy to be here. My name is Cheng, and I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for Campus Advocacy Network. And I'm so happy that you're here to join us for a one-on-one with Ken and GSC. And we're here every other week, every other Thursday at 12:30. And we initiate this project. It's about knowing people's story, utilizing creativity and multimedia, build intimate communities. And so one person at a time and one story at a time. So Moises, take it over.
Hello, everyone. My name is Moises Villada, Associate Director at the Gender and Sexuality Center. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Very excited to join you one more time on Facebook Live to really get to a deeper understanding of the people we work with, we connect with. This is a wonderful collaboration between Campus Advocacy Network and the Gender and Sexuality Center. And I actually have the honor of introducing our featured guest today. So today we have Rich Havard, a native Southerner from Gloucester, Mississippi, who actually moved to Chicago in 2014 to work for Urban Village Church. He really feels that he's called by God to really bring people together and create welcoming spaces. He holds a BA in religion. He has a Master of Divinity, has done trainings for nonprofit leadership, anti-racism, and has taught in the Theological Studies program at Lee Ardenal State Prison. He has a lot of interests, one of those being coffee, which if you ever met Rich, you know that that's one of his favorite things. And we're just excited to have him here with us today. So welcome, Rich.
Thanks so much, Moises, and great to be with y'all and to be with all of our friends who are tuning in on live stream. Thanks for the invitation.
Very good. I guess I will have the first question. So, Rich, this is interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I attended GSC's the orientation. There's one thing that you said really struck me to my core. You said, I wish GSC was something that I had when I was a student, something along that line, right? What were you like when you were a student? What were your experiences like? And you can take us back to kindergarten, high school, junior high, or college. No matter how old you are, feel free to expand. So what were you like as a student?
Yeah, that's such a wide question. So different things. So I won't tell much about early on, but I do have one funny story is that people often are surprised by is that I'm a preschool dropout. So when I was in pre-K, I didn't like the teacher, and in a weird way, my mom let me drop out of preschool. So that's like my origin education story, preschool dropout. But so more into the college life, probably was what we'll get into today, is I went to school at a small liberal arts school, very different from UIC, in Birmingham, Alabama, a Southern Baptist institution. At the time, I was Southern Baptist, so it fit into my religious tradition and trajectory. And so, what was I like? I was someone who thought I knew what I wanted to do since I was 16. So I was on a sort of like one-way track of I want to be a pastor. This is the way to get there. I need to study religion, and then I need to go get my Master's of Divinity and then go be a pastor. And so in some senses, I was very focused, hyper-focused in that area. In some senses to a detriment, not allowing myself to really venture outside of that field and study other things. I always say if I had to go back, I'd probably study business, because so many skills that I need and utilize today leading a nonprofit, I would have had a good understanding if I would have studied business. At the same time, had this fabulous religion department. Often if you think of a Southern Baptist school's religion department, you may think of, it's going to be really hyper conservative and closed-minded. But actually, the professors were very open, and they sort of flew under the radar for the school, but they were quite lovely and really opened up my mind and my heart and my spirit to new ways of thinking and being in the world. I would say one of the things is I was one of my thoughts, I think, in school, or at least one of the hard parts was I was so over-identified with grades, right? And it was like, oh, grades were the sort of like pinnacle for me around everything. So if I was stressed to the max all the time about school, I was and don't get me wrong, grades can be fine and we want to try, etc. But it was a little bit too much. It was like, all right, I could have made time for some other things to have a little bit more of some spaciousness in my life. But yeah, those are some of the things. To get at your question, Ada, about wanting to wishing there was a GSC, a Gender and Sexuality Center, at my undergrad. I was closeted the whole time I was an undergrad, and in a lot of ways wasn't even aware myself that I was gay. And so much of that is because of a real lack of representation. I didn't know many people at all who were openly queer. I certainly didn't know any professors, faculty, staff members, folks like that, mentors. And so that's one of the reasons I say that every year at the GSC open house. And I truly believe it. It's like, how distinct would my experience have been from what it was, this like real wrestling, to if I would have had folks like you all and other people in my life and whole centers dedicated to the well-being and empowerment of queer students. So yeah, that was not part of my narrative. In a lot of ways, I wish it would have been.
Wow. And you're making me think of in navigating this journey, this personal journey, this academic journey, what were some of the lessons that you learned? What were some of the mistakes that maybe you made that you're like, oh my gosh, like that really is something that has stayed with me all these years? Can you think of maybe at least one example of something you've learned during those college years?
So many lessons, right? Learn from both success and failure. Failure is often one of the best teachers. One of the things I think I try to live by now is not putting life on hold until we complete things. I think it's really easy for me, at least still in some ways now, but especially when you're in the academic rhythm, it's really easy to think, okay, my life is on hold until I get my degree. My life was on hold until I get my master's. And I just don't think that's true. Like, and my life wasn't fully on hold. I did some things, but if I could go back and sort of expand my view of like, hey, you're going to be in college and grad school for 7 years total. That is a long time. And life is not on hold until I finish my master's. And so go and like treat college basically as like one of your things, but have this other like way of being in the city and expanding kind of your networks and getting involved in other sort of like sectors. And yeah, it's sort of, I often use the example of like, it's sort of like if you're driving in a car, something a lot of us don't do a lot in the city, but I don't even have a car. But when you're driving in a car and then you get somewhere and you think, I don't know if this has happened to y'all, and you get there and you think, what just happened for the past 2 hours? I don't even remember like driving. I don't remember like passing through this city, and it's just, you're so like out of it. It's almost like numb to everything. And then you get there and you're like, oh, how did I end up here? And I think it's really easy to do that, to be like, get out of, yeah.
And I love what you're saying. I know Ada has another question, but really just to say that you're making me think of what you're kind of saying for me, and what's resonating is that you're also trying to say, be present with what's happening and tap into that, pay attention to that. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing really interesting is, you mentioned that you wanted to be a pastor, right? The religion is the route. And then when, Moises was introducing you, for example, the queer identity, anti-racism training, diversity, all these in some way are very counter to our common understanding of religion. Did you struggle with this contradiction at all in terms of it while, as a college student, as a young man pursuing the religious, degree, while, and I'm not sure about what your politics like when you were a student, did you feel any tension, contradiction? Did you wrestle with that at all when you were a young man?
Sure. Yeah. It's a complicated question, right? The church, at least the sort of like dominant expressions of church, particularly in this country, and even more particular, like white, more conservative churches and white progressive churches have really caused a lot of harm to people of color, to poor folks, to queer folks, etc. And so, and I grew up again in a small town where like religion was everything in Mississippi. But to be specific, I kind of had two ways of thinking of. So I grew up in that town with this like particular brand of Christianity that sometimes you can just call it what it is, which is like white nationalism with a thin veneer of like religious language, right? And that's sometimes how faith is practiced. And so grew up sort of swimming in those waters, but then had a couple of pastors in my small Southern Baptist church in Mississippi who did faith a different way. And, I didn't have the language for it then. They wouldn't have said like, we're progressive Christians or anything like that. They just were like leaning into another expression of the faith that I found a lot more compelling. It was intellectually robust. It was justice oriented, particularly for that setting. I remember the pastor preaching against racism, the pastor preaching against people who are against women's ordination. And that was quite radical for the context. I mean, we're talking about my hometown's a place where I remember in Sunday school in, I think the 7th and 8th or 8th grade, middle school, the teacher came down and said, y'all know what tomorrow is? And we said, yeah, it's MLK Day. We have off of school. And he said, wrong. It's James Earl Ray Appreciation Day. Of course, it was King's assassin. And so that was sort of the context of a lot of things, but then had these other folks in the direction. And that was like so life-giving for me because they showed me a Christianity that can inspire us to be people of justice and service in the world. The kind of faith that inspired, some justice movements in this country. Particularly, Christianity is often at its best when it's led by people who are on the margins of dominant structures. And so these days, where I sort of take my cues from, folks like Black women or womanist theologians is what they're called, who are like, all right, we need to be looking to the margins because Christianity, is most beautiful whenever we follow the lead of those folks.
And Rich, as you're sharing all of this, you're making me think of what are the ways that you were able to cope and navigate those challenging environments and people, right? I mean, it sounds like it was a struggle, but how were you able to manage that adversity really? Like, how were you able to cope with it? And maybe sharing some ways that maybe even, students and people who are watching this can help navigate some of that.
Yeah, think about a couple of things. One is find your people, right? It's like even into college, I was in dialogue and in relationship with people across vast lines of difference, and I think that is a skill we need to have. We live in a very diverse society. It's not about like sort of making things milquetoast, but we need to have the capacity to dialogue across lines of difference. But you also need your people. Like, you need your people who are like your ride or dies, the folks who have your back, the folks whom you like really think really similar as, the folks who are helping you hone your ideas and who you are, the ones who ask deep questions about you, and the ones you feel safe with. And so while we do need to do that sort of cross talk, we also just need our folks. So that's a huge one. Is like my people were just so supportive of me in so many ways. Like I remember coming out and they like wanted to throw me a party. So like those kinds of folks. And then the other thing I think about is spiritual practices, like whatever your faith tradition, or if you're atheist or agnostic, to use some more expansive language like mindfulness, things, I heard a theologian once say like, we're not brains on a stick, right? We're not just like the intellectual life is not the only part of our life that we need to be nurturing. It's also like, what are we doing with our souls? What's the deep inner work that we have to do? What are we doing with our bodies through somatic healing experiences? How are we really not just thinking our way through things, but being embodied and being soulful as we seek to find healing and sustenance for the work ahead? That I'm thinking more and more about these days. I think it's particularly a white and Western phenomenon to be like, if we have work to do, it's all head work. Like, let's read a book, let's start a discussion club, And I'm not against reading or discussion. It's great. But it's like there is more on offer that I think we need to pursue. And that spiritual practices were what really kept me grounded and rooted in those like difficult days.
I have two questions. It's really interesting. The first one is you say find my people, right? And as I was producing, I'm doing a lot of programming for camp. And one of the things I say to students, particularly new students, especially, during the pandemic, everything is virtual, very difficult to make connections. So how do you find your people? How do you find the space that works for you on a college campus? So if you can give a few strategies, right? And especially as your identity changes, how do you constantly shifting that, finding different people, right? There's one. The second question is about healing, right? Your role as a pastor, or even, college students, spiritual, how do you go about in terms of a healing with trauma or violence, and how do you heal? So these two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ada. The first question, how do you find your people? One of the beautiful gifts of a place like UIC that is the size of UIC is that you can find really niche communities, right? Is you can find like, through all the Centers for Cultural Understanding and Social Change, through so many different, majors and organizations and registered student organizations, et cetera, is there's really, there's a thing for most people. Even, I'm involved in what's called at UIC, the Religious Workers Association, which is the interfaith clergy group. And we have students all the time asking about where is there like this club or this club or this club. And for most religious traditions, there is some club, some organization, some faculty member who's a sponsor. And if there's not, people can create it. And the religious diversity at UIC is not something that we talk a lot about at diversity, but it is huge. I mean, there's so much religious diversity in addition to racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, gender, all these other markers that make this a really unique place. Religious diversity is not talked about, but it's huge. And so I think that's one thing is like you can go search for it. I think one of the things I tell my students is oftentimes community does not happen just sort of like by happenstance. There are times whenever you may stumble into something and find an organic community, but community, it's actually kind of hard. And especially if people want robust, deep community, it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. So it's like, all right, we're not just going to like show up to class and all of a sudden have friends. It's like, all right, we need to take initiative, go find some folks. And I think if you do that, if you take that leap, and it does take some courage to do that, and Dr. here to support people in doing that work, but you can find your people. So that's one thing. And even right now, I'd say is like take the leap on technology. I think it is a higher bar to enter into a Zoom room with all kinds of new people. And I every time we have an event where a new, especially a first year or transfer student shows up, I just give a shout out to them. Like, kudos to you for showing up into a Zoom room with people you have no idea who they are and like letting them into your house. I just think that's just really inspirational for me. So yeah, even now, go to things like this and find people. So that's the find your people thing. And one more addition to that is like, not everybody has to be your person, right? Like there are going to be some people you don't click with. There are going to be some people who don't click with you. It's like find some folks, and it can be a small group. Like you don't have to be friends with 100 people. You can be friends with 3 people, 2 people, and those are develop really intimate connections. So that's find your people. In terms of healing, so many things. In the Inclusive Collective, I view it as a high honor that people who have been wounded by ministry malpractice trust us enough to try faith again. We have so many people who have been wounded, queer folks who have been kicked out, seekers and doubters and skeptics who have been told their questions aren't welcome, people who are aiming for justice, who feel like the church is too often standing in the way of progress. All these folks who have been hurt and burned by the church but still find something compelling about Christianity, about spirituality more broadly, and want to be connected. And so I'm so grateful that they come and experience us. And so one of the things we try to do is be honest about one of the things the Christian tradition, I think, gives us, and other traditions as well, is this deep well of like lament resources. And so, so often I think in our context is we want to like fast forward through pain and just get to how do we fix? What's the action? What's it look like to be healed? And it's like, well, healing doesn't happen like this. And so how do we, and for instance, you know, in Christianity's book, the Bible, there are so many resources take the Psalms, which are sort of like the hymn book of Christianity, the song book. So many of them are songs of lament, of deep pain and sorrow. God, why is this happening? Why is my neighbor doing this? What is going on in my life? Why are we trapped in the systems of injustice? There's a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations. It's a book about lament. So I think that's one thing that we offer that's distinct, is to say, hey, your pain is real. Your pain is valid. Now, how do we name it in community in a way that honors our deep pain? So that's one. And then I think trying to teach people spiritual practices, because there's a difference in like wallowing in the pain versus like working through the pain. So
I love that. Rich, that's fantastic.
Just a couple of comments that I find really, really important. I'll hand it to you, Moises. One thing that you mentioned about community is community doesn't just exist. You have to make it, right? And you reach out, right? It's constantly changing. And you really, it's how you make it. You make meanings out of it, right? And that's one thing really important. And I really like the conversation about healing, because I'm doing a lot of events on storytelling. It's not therapy per se, but it's therapeutic, right? And I don't, I'm spiritual, but I'm not necessarily religious. And so I like what I do is in some way it's about healing. But I find that as I sort of provide a space for healing, I'm also healing myself as well. Yeah. And I like what you say, you have to really walk through it, go through it, that. Yeah.
Storytelling.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Moises.
My final question before Ada closes us out. The final question is: what are you, with everything going on in the world, and it's really layered right now, what are you hopeful for?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I am hopeful for a few things. One is I am hopeful that some of the ways we've relearned to be and live in the world that we've been forced to learn during the middle of the pandemic, slowing down, not overfilling our calendars, not letting success or busyness or productivity define us as the particular American brand of capitalism often makes us. And so I'm hopeful that it's going to be a struggle for me. I'm someone who loves to fill up my calendar and that's, but I'm hopeful that we let some of these practices stick and we sort of become a different sort of society into the future. Related to that, I am hopeful made hopeful by the fire, passion, zeal of my students, of UIC students, of Generation Z in particular, who are ready for change and will not take no for an answer. And so are particularly in this moment of racial justice, and obviously that is ongoing, but yeah, we're in a particular flashpoint of things related to the pandemic and how that is not causing for there to be discrepancies in how people are treated, but really unmasking what already existed. And these sorts of things where, my students are just that, like, good luck for like good luck to the status quo.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be hard for it to stay the status quo for long.
So one final question. One of the things that, when I think about how I get through the pandemic, I think a lot about graduate school experience. It's very isolating. You just do work on your own. you get through life with, tenacity, right? Grit. And I know religion is a huge part of a source of inspiration and strength. Are there other sources of strength that you draw upon beyond religion that help you get through, right, the chaos and the dismal world at this point? What other sources that provide you the internal inner strength?
Yeah, for sure. I think I have a pretty broad definition of spirituality. And so, in a lot of ways, I kind of consider so many other parts of my life religious or spiritual experiences. And so, even things that aren't traditional practices, like reading sacred text or praying in a particular way. So a couple of things that I named that I would still consider spiritual practices, but that are sort of non-traditional. So I think getting in touch with our bodies and whatever ways that our bodies that work for our bodies, right? So like for me, that looks like working out in a particular way because I like to live in my head a lot, and so going to be active helps me reach into and experience another part of myself that I don't when I'm just like sitting at my desk like reading or whatnot. So bodily practices, and there are lots of ways to do that. It doesn't have to involve working out in a particular way. It can work for whatever way is good for folks' bodies. And then reading fiction is huge for me. And so it is makes me more creative, makes me more, it kind of takes you to a different place and gives you a little bit of sense of reprieve in the midst of what all is happening. And not in terms of like burying my head in the sand, but just a little bit of something during all that's going on. And then community, friends, like my partner and I love to host people, love to, have dinners in socially distanced ways. Building that community that takes a lot of effort, but that is so worth it because community is like where you go when things hit the fan, and it's and you need some support. So yeah, those are three things that are and coffee, of course, to your those are three things that are sort of like keeping me going right now.
Very good. Thank you so much. I love that, when you talk about literature, right, a lot of it's about art, community, that it's really about emotion, vulnerability, as opposed to reason or intellect, right? Things that oftentimes are devalued in academia, but it's so important for survival and solidarity and perseverance, right? So yesterday at the workshop, we talked about how what we each other have, right? How do we survive together? And what we depend on is art, literature, creativity, community, family, and friends. All these things are important. Yeah. So I want to thank you, Rich. We're at the end of our show. It's 2 minutes from 1:00. We did it. Thank you so much for being here. So Moises, how do you feel? Tell me, how are you feeling as I wrap up this conversation?
I love these conversations, and thank you, Rich, for always bringing a new definition of what it means to heal, what it means to be in community, what it means to be yourself. Like, I really think we need to be in spaces where we hear the broader definitions of all of these things we've been conditioned to believe, and to reimagine and redefine what that looks like for us. So thank you for always bringing that to the table wherever we're at in conversations, in the spaces we navigate. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for spending time with us, and just grateful for your existence into our worlds.
Yeah, no, thanks to you both for the invitation and for the work that you do. I mean, both of you do such important work that's making UIC a better, more hospitable, just, and equitable place for our students. And so I'm really grateful.
It's better that comes from you, not we saying it ourselves. So thank you for saying that, for praising us. Right. I usually don't have problems saying that myself, but I appreciate that you say that. Yeah. So thank you so much, Rich. I really appreciate this conversation. We did it, Moises.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who is watching and participating. We'll see you next time.
See you in 2 weeks. We have another special guest. So bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all. Thanks so much.
Bye.